Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. Extra amazing because Ryan is here. Bro show. People live for the pound. That's what it's all about. Let's go ahead and see what we've got on deck. We're going to start with Hurricane Milton and all of the updates around that. I actually looked at the data. Florida is one of the largest states in terms of audience for our show. So for all of them down there, we are thinking about you, and we're going to try and update you and the entire country about this imminent potential disaster.
Huge portion of our audience may be in the car right now listening to this.
Very possible. We wish you absolutely the best. Yes. We're going to try and keep you guys as up to date as possible. Obviously, a storm that's going to devastate potentially Florida, but also potentially reshape a lot of our national conversation around that. But we're going to start with just the facts, and then perhaps we'll get into some of the analysis. We're also going to talk about Kamala Harris. She appeared on 60 Minutes last night. There is a lot to say about that. I think we'll just leave it at that. There's quite a few clips and other things, her foibles, perhaps her strengths as president. We're going to talk about the polls. We are going to look with Logan Phillips in one of our exclusive segments here. Some of it will be public available today, but a lot of it is going to be behind the paywall up until later. That's for our premium subscribers. That's an incentive for you to go ahead and sign up. We're going to talk about the State Department, where Ryan actually dropped a big story over at DropSite with his colleagues, and then the State Department was pressed about that. Finally, we are going to talk about Hillary Clinton in a recent interview on censorship. And then we have a great guest, Jefferson Morley, on JFK and some new revelations about Lee Harvey Oswald and some of the other shenanigans that he was potentially up to. I won't tease too much because Jefferson is just such an intelligent guy. He's been following this for almost his entire life. So much scholarship on the JFK assassination. He's got even more new revelations that add to the picture of what happened. So let's go ahead and start with Hurricane Milton. We're going to borrow here from Ryan Hall. Some of you may know him on YouTube. Never met him. We reached out to him, by the way, Ryan, if you're listening. We would love to host you, but he really has some of the best weather analysis out there. And so we thought we would just borrow from him and play some clips so that you guys can see what he is looking at in terms of Hurricane Milton, its acceleration into a Category 5 hurricane. And now I believe it's the 4th or 5th most powerful hurricane in this region of the world ever seen by humanity. So let's go ahead and take a listen to Ryan.
Major Hurricane Milton is a high-end Category 3 hurricane with 125-mile-per-hour winds, and the pressure's down there around 945 millibars. This is astronomically stronger than what it was yesterday, and that intensification is going to continue today. As soon as 2 a.m. early in the morning tomorrow, we could have a high-end Category 4 with 155-mile-per-hour winds right here just to the north of the Yucatan Peninsula near Progreso, Mexico. I really hope that the people down here in Mexico are watching out for this one, because this is taking a really strange approach. I don't know if this area has ever had to deal with a hurricane like this coming in at this angle and at this intensity. This is going to be a pretty bad situation for Mexico, especially if it takes a more southern track here, because it's going to be at its peak intensity right here. The official forecast is, of course, for 155 mile per hour Category 4 storm. However, I really do believe that this could very well be a Category 5, maybe even by the end of today, not even tomorrow. And then it could be a high-end Category 5 by the time it gets to this area, especially if it continues to strengthen in the unbelievable fashion that it has so far. But from there, it is going to start slowly weakening, okay? We do expect it to be down to 150 miles per hour as it goes a little bit farther to the east. Once it gets between the Yucatan Peninsula and Florida, as it's really starting to approach Florida, it's going to be down to 144 miles per hour. And then we expect it to make landfall, or at least be just off the coast of Florida, as a Category 3 major hurricane on Wednesday, sometime after 2 p.m. and before 8 p.m.
There you go. So 8 p.m., that is really when, Wednesday, overnight up until the morning on Thursday. Unfortunately, by the time we do the show here on Thursday, we're going to have some images for you. We'll know the extent, at least, of some of the limited and early amounts of damage. Let's go ahead and put this next one up on the screen. This is from Noah Bergen. He is a meteorologist down in Florida for Fox Orlando. Here's what he says, quote, "This is nothing short of astronomical. I am at a loss for words to meteorologically describe you. The storm's small I and intensity, 897 mbp pressure with 180 miles per hour, max sustained winds and gusts of 200 miles per hour plus. This is now the 4th strongest hurricane ever recorded by pressure on this side of the world. The eye is tiny at nearly 3.8 miles wide. This hurricane is nearing the mathematical limit of what Earth's atmosphere over the ocean water can produce. So let that one sink in about just how powerful a storm can get. As of 5 a.m. this morning, the update that he's given us is just that that they're continually looking at the storm, that there's been some mild weakening, but that is not going to stop the impact and the potential storm surges. Those surges look devastating, Ryan, and all of this has prompted massive evacuation. We have some pictures that we can show here. Let's go ahead and see some of that video. Yeah, you're looking there. This is evacuation in progress in Sarasota. This is a look at the northbound traffic on I-75 as residents began to make their escapes. There's a lot of reports coming out of Florida about sold-out hotel rooms, about gas lines, about horrible traffic. So really thinking about everybody there. But this is a devastating storm, Ryan, and the storm surge is no joke, some 8 to 10 feet in some areas. As I understand it, one of the things that makes it so unique is it's coming there onto that coast of Florida towards Tampa. Tampa's not had a major hurricane that's hit it in about 100 years. And so a lot of the residents, particularly because
some damage from Helene even.
Right, but there's been a lot of new residents that live in Tampa in particular who are not used to perhaps the hurricane warnings and evacuation and all that. So public officials are sounding the alarm as big as they can. They're like, if you are in an evacuation zone, you need to get the hell out of there as soon as possible. So hoping that our listeners who are in the Tampa area and any others, please heed your local evacuation orders and all this, because this looks bad.
And what's remarkable about the Ryan Hall clips is that, he's expecting it to come in at, 130, 140. It's going to be a serious storm, but it all of a sudden, almost instantly, like people were saying, they never seen anything happen that quickly.
The acceleration from storm to Category 5.
Right, they were expecting, okay, this is unfortunate for Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, and I hope everybody's safe over there. It'll be down to maybe 130, 140 as it creeps across over closer to Florida. And then Milton had other ideas. And instantly, it's, wow, we're talking 175, 180. Somebody, I saw some meteorologist saying that it was approaching the mathematical possibilities for our atmosphere. Yeah, exactly. Right. Which is what a harrowing line. Like, what does that even mean? And what's beyond those possibilities? Like this is it. And I think you're exactly right to highlight the fact that so many millions of people have flooded, no pun intended, Florida over the last couple of years in search of this great weather and this cheaper housing as they've been driven out of other places. To then match that migration with this storm hitting these folks who aren't prepared for it. There's nobody in Florida has a basement. Yeah. And a lot of these houses are slapped together. Like these are
they're very newly constructed.
This is not in Jamaica, British Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, like these are cinder block houses, weathered by hundreds of years of hurricanes, where they can hunker down in that bunker. That's not what you have throughout a lot of Florida.
It's really devastating. Let's go to the next one. This kind of underscores what you're talking about. Only 7 hurricanes have gone from Category 1 to Category 5 in 24 hours. Milton is now actually the second fastest to ever do so. Let's go A5 also, please, up on the screen. This is for anyone who is watching. These are the evacuation areas that you can see from Jacksonville, Fort Myers, Jupiter, Orlando, Tampa. They are also highlighting in green the cities where they are recommending that there will not be power outages. So a personal friend of mine is actually in Miami, lives in the Tampa area, but they are in the northern, above Florida, above the Panhandle. They're recommending people go to Columbia, Charleston, Savannah, Macon, Atlanta, Birmingham, Montgomery, Mobile, Panama City, Jackson, and New Orleans. So yeah, evacuating a hurricane just to have to go to New Orleans, kind of ironic there. Let's go to the next one. This again just highlights the flooding. This is really devastating. I believe that this is from FEMA, and this shows just on the coast of what the expected storm surge will look like. So as I said, the Tampa Bay area is expecting some 8 to 12 feet of storm surge. I mean, it's 8 to 12 feet of water that will come in. And if you've ever been to that city, just how much of it is there on the coast. They're also looking at 5 to 10 feet in other areas, and even a quote unquote small one of 2 to 4 feet in the less affected. But as I understand it, that is double of what Hurricane Helene brought. And already they had a lot of debris that was on the ground from Hurricane hurricane Helene, one of the major priorities of Florida authorities over the next 24 hours is actually to pick up as much debris as possible to forestall any flying around debris and projectiles that would break a lot of property in the area. But people there are really bracing, and what we actually want to highlight is an interview that the mayor of Tampa just gave last night, where she said, I can say this without any dramatization whatsoever. If you choose to stay in one of those evacuation areas, you are going to die. Let's take a listen.
What would you say to people tonight who are saying, you know what, I'm going to ride this out, I've ridden others out? What would you say to people who aren't heeding those evacuation orders?
Well, I can tell you right now that they may have done that in others. There's never been one like this. And this, Helene was a wake-up call. This is literally catastrophic. And I can say without any dramatization whatsoever, if you choose to stay in one of those evacuation areas, you're going to die.
You are going to die. So that's obviously pretty intense stuff there coming from the mayor of Tampa, Ryan. And
it's so difficult for everybody to evacuate. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. The problem with this is that people think you can just wave a magic wand and you're like, oh, evacuation is happening. But like I said, especially lower income folks, we saw a lot of this during Katrina. People who don't have a lot of money. Gas, obviously, right now is a scarce commodity, as I understand it. Traffic as well was a problem. A lot of these hotel rooms are sold out. Many people are going to have to get on the road for 8 to 10 hours just to be able to make it to a metro area. I know it's heard some stories in my own personal life, multiple flights canceled out of that area. They're gonna have to drive somewhere else just to try and be able to get on a flight so they have somewhere to go. Thousands of dollars out of pocket costs, obviously, that they're incurring. Some people have 4 dogs or whatever. I just saw a story this morning. People who, they don't know what to do. They don't have any money, and they really feel helpless in this. So that is perhaps the most devastating part out of this. People who are elderly, a lot of pensioners, people who live down there on a fixed income. And so having to flex in a disaster time like this is really scary. And you only have 48 hours or 72 hours or whatever to repair. It's just not a lot of time. It's not.
A lot of those people have difficulty driving to the grocery store and back.
There you go, right.
Driving like 15 hours with no place to go. That's the hard part, especially for people who, can't afford these price gouging that's going on when it comes either to gas or if you can eventually find a place to stay. But I would say if you're in that zone, it is worth it. Like whatever the risks are that you have to take to evacuate, like take those risks rather than thinking, you know what, I can actually probably hunker down and get through this. And psychologically, it's so difficult because your home is your sanctuary. It's a place that feels safe. It's the place where you want to go to when you're in danger. And so to be told, no, actually, you need to get out of there. There's a psychological barrier that you have to climb over. But like that, and the mayor is trying to give you that push over the top. Like if you stay in these flood evacuation zones, a higher zone that is an evacuation zone, you're very likely going to die, but at least you're not going to definitely die because of the flooding. But in the lower zones, it's going to be hell on earth.
I was looking at photos of like Tampa Bay Hospital and others that are, right on sea level, right by the ocean with an 8 to 12 feet storm surge. It just looks absolutely devastating.
People in critical care there?
That's right. People are in critical care. I mean, look, Florida, obviously, the authorities there, they seem to know what they're doing. They're trying their best with the evacuation order. The government actually seems like it's all in. Ron DeSantis, there was some, controversy where he allegedly declined a phone call from Kamala Harris. He's denying that. But he did say, look, the Biden administration is giving me all the resources that I need. And so we'll watch this very closely. October is hurricane season. Obviously, in the U.S., we have a long history of hurricanes. Right before the election, there will be a lot of eyeballs on Florida as they have to rebuild, as we have to look at the disaster, perhaps supplementals. Congress may have to come back into town. But right now in the interim, just for everybody there, like I said, we have a large audience in Florida. please stay safe. Please heed local evacuation orders, especially with the devastation that the projection of what the storm is. Even if the storm does slow down, as I understand it, just making landfall at Category 4 is still not a joke. And with the storm surge alone, that can cause a significant amount of devastation. So really thinking about everybody in Florida. Like I said, for our audience, please heed the advice of your local evacuation authorities and orders. Let's go to the next part and just give some political insight. I think, also into what the American political establishment prefers to care about. The depravity of our leaders, what their real priorities are. And I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but I just had to play it in the context of what we're looking at here. Here is Senator Lindsey Graham talking about how, the flooding in North and South Carolina, it was definitely bad, but we got to think about Israel right now. Let's take a listen.
You can thank Donald Trump and Elon Musk for that. I've been going all over South Carolina like most people. I hadn't slept much. But look what's going on in Israel. Our friends in Israel are surrounded by people that want to kill them, destroy them, a second Holocaust in the making. And Biden says, be proportional. What is the proportional response to people who want to kill you and your family? Gosh. They're running out of ammunition in Israel. We have to help our friends to keep the war over there from coming here.
I've been all over South Carolina, but can't you just think about Israel and our friends in Israel? I mean, look, that's everything for me. And look, there's been a lot of conversation that I've seen online, and people are always attacked. They're like, talking about FEMA resources, where they've gone in the past. But the one where I think people have America dead to rights is look at all this money that we freely, without Congress, without debate, we are willing to ship overseas to fund foreign conflicts. But there are now hundreds of people who are confirmed dead from Hurricane Helene alone. Let's put this up there. 227 people have now officially been confirmed dead from Hurricane Helene. And the, quote, grim task of recovering bodies continues. Nobody knows what the final death toll from this hurricane will be. Perhaps even this hurricane will be eclipsed in terms of damage by Hurricane Milton, which we just talked about. But just consider, that these entire communities destroyed. Something we talked about in a previous show here about Hurricane Helene is that the city of Asheville was one of the most booming cities in all of North Carolina. And we know that statistically 50% of small businesses never reopen after being destroyed by a hurricane. So that just sucks the soul out of what was a thriving tourist destination here on the East Coast. Actually, it had a lot of people who moved there from all across the country and then were devastated by the floods. And I can't help but think also about Tampa as well. I mean, I personally know people who just moved to Tampa. A lot of people have. That entire area of Florida, one of the most economically dynamic in the U.S., not just pensioners, but a lot of younger people, families like you talked about, who want to be able to afford a home for $300,000-400,000 grand, something like that. And now all of a sudden, staring down the barrel of a similar situation. So when I just put those two things side by side, I'm just disgusted. I really am. I'm disgusted.
Did you notice that the control room tried to bail Lindsey Graham out a little bit there? He's talking about Israel while they have in the background all of the B-roll devastation from Hurricane Helene, and they very quickly get rid of that and give him just his normal background. So it's just standard Lindsey Graham talking about how Israel's running out of ammunition. Come on, control room. You could have done the people a solid there and just left the B-roll
you should have. You're right.
Like leave that split screen up for people to really get the full grasp of what's going on. But I was just thinking about how, I remember in 2020, I was down at the Panhandle driving through there, and Hurricane Michael had ripped through there 2 years earlier, 2018.
I remember that.
The devastation was still everywhere 2 years later. Like things boarded up, debris on the side of homes. It looked like the storm had happened a month ago, but it had been 2 years. Like this stuff takes much longer to recover from, I think, than people realize. No,
you're right. I had the opportunity at some point, to be able to see some tsunami devastation when I was in Asia, even years later after the tsunami had hit. Look, it's Asia, it's different. But I'm just, to your point, even years later, it's like, wow, it's been multiple years since that happened, and there's still a lot of damage that's over here. And so when we're thinking here about storm surge and just coming some 15 days or whatever after Hurricane Helene, that really is just so devastating for people down there, and just highlights about, let's see what the national conversation is like, after this, where we were going to have Americans are in need, these people who've been devastated just in having to evacuate, and now these victims of the hurricane in Hurricane Helene and in North Carolina, potentially, there's some 3 million people or whatever who live in the Tampa metro area. That's a lot of people.
It's a huge number of people.
Massive. I mean, and then when we consider the impact on their lives, those businesses, all the people that are down there, I would hope that the U.S. government and others can actually focus its attention on our own citizens. But I'm not going to hold my breath. Definitely not going to hold my breath. Not only because you would think in an election year, that's the time when you most want to pay attention to your own citizens and to highlight to others what, the government's entire purpose is, if not for disaster purposes. But instead, all attention is on funding as much war in the Middle East or in Ukraine as there is possible. It's like in Ukraine, whenever, a Russian facility takes out an energy, whatever facility or whatever, there's plenty of American dollars. I remember reading a story about how the United States is funding a small yarn saleswoman in Ukraine to prop up civil society. And I'm like, it would be nice maybe if you run a yarn store in Asheville, North Carolina, if you had a similar program that'll cut you a check, basically, no questions asked, and perhaps now in Tampa. So yeah, I'm just genuinely disgusted by the attitude around this entire thing. Let's go to the next part. We'll talk about Kamala Harris and this interview that she gave on 60 Minutes. There is a lot to say here. I think we'll focus first on this. The answer about changing position. This is where it's funny because
she had a couple months to
even CNN, even CNN and Dana Bash in the most tong-bathing interview possible by a national news host, she asked in the most tepid way possible, some people say you change your positions, and how do you square that? And you would think, considering how awful that answer was, that you may change your tune. Well, turns out it hasn't changed all that much, and if anything, frankly, the answer has gotten worse. Let's take a listen.
You were for Medicare for all. Now you're not. So many that people don't truly know what you believe or what you stand for. And I know you've heard that.
In the last 4 years, I have been Vice President of the United States. And I have been traveling our country. And I have been listening to folks and seeking what is possible in terms of common ground. I believe in building consensus. We are a diverse people. Geographically, regionally, in terms of where we are in our backgrounds. And what the American people do want is that we have leaders who can build consensus, where we can figure out compromise and understand it's not a bad thing, as long as you don't compromise your values, to find common sense solutions. And that has been my approach.
That has been my approach. She basically said, well, I've traveled a lot and
heard from other people.
And look, I've even said this. Crystal disagrees with me. I'm curious what you think. I think at a certain point, you need to just own up and be like, look, I said a lot of things. It's clear the American people don't agree with me. I want to be president. I'm a consensus builder. But a lot of this is all like, my values haven't changed. And I'm about, but you never come out and actually just say it. So I'm curious what you think, Ryan.
The closest she ever got to that, I don't know if you saw this interview she did with Stephen Colbert, where he said...
That was also last night, yeah.
Well, this was a couple years ago.
Okay.
Back in 2020, after she was named vice president, he had her on and she said, well, you're now vice president. You basically called this guy a segregationist a couple months ago.
Yes, that's right.
And she laughed and she said, that was a debate.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I remember that. Yeah,
and
that's right.
The premise, the unspoken premise of that answer is, it was a game. I was point scoring. I was just trying to get ahead in a political contest. So that's what she has to try to get across to make your point without sounding like the most cynical person ever. But Tim Walz answered it the best when it's like, well, you used to be, for assault weapons, now you're against them. How did that happen? Well, I sat with the victims of the Sandy Hook shooting.
Which means that changed another way of saying that is I had new information.
I had new information.
Okay.
So I think she could get away with a version of that answer if she said, look, I was running as a Democratic candidate for the nomination in 2020. That was before I was president, or I was vice president, and I've now seen the difficulty of governing, and so now I understand that some of that stuff, while it might be amazing and wonderful, we're just not going to be able to get it done.
Right.
But I'd still love to see it in a world where it was possible. But then she's stuck again because, well, that doesn't answer your immigration question. How'd you go from, because that is the world of possible.
Right.
That's executive orders, that's executive action. So, yeah, I mean, she got to look, I'm a politician. I just want to be president.
Yeah, and
we all know this.
Speaking of word salad, we saw this also on how are you going to avoid an all-out regional war? Let's take a listen.
The events of the past few weeks have pushed us to the brink, if not into, an all-out regional war in the Middle East. What can the U.S. do at this point to stop this from spinning out of control?
Well, let's start with October 7. 1,200 people were massacred. 250 hostages were taken, including Americans. Women were brutally raped. And as I said then, I maintain Israel has a right to defend itself. We would. And how it does so matters. Far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. This war has to end.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly? How are you going to, so remember the question, how are you going to avoid nuclear war? October 7th was really bad. Well, that wasn't the question that you were asked. You were asked about how you're going to prevent a nuclear war, and then eventually, oh, the war has to end. But when you say, and you lead with, but October 7th was so horrible, what are you saying? You're like, well, maybe I do support a little bit of a regional war. And there's an answer that we're going to get to in a little bit. It deserves its own block about who she thinks America's greatest adversary is, where maybe she does. Maybe she's just being authentic and honest. She's like, yeah, I think a war with Iran is a good thing.
She has this segment memorized very clearly. Like, we have heard her say this line of precise words so many times in the month that she's been running. Like, I can almost recite it at this point now.
Right.
Let's start with October 7th. 1,200 people massacred,
right.
250 people taken hostage, including Americans, brutally raped. It's always, quote, brutally raped. And Israel has a right to defend itself. We would defend ourselves. I said it then, I'll say it again. And then she does her pivot, where her advisors are like, you have to now give something to the side of the people who think that this is horrific. And so then she says, but how it does so matters.
Yes.
And then she adds, far too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. And then finally, another non sequitur, this war has to end. As if it's just going to end on its own, or Netanyahu's going to just decide to end it at some point. What's going on here, I think, is that the reason that Israel has no day after plan is that they have never had to have one. They've always just pushed as far as they possibly can, and then the Americans tug the leash and say, okay, Biden picks up the phone, Reagan picks up the phone, whoever, and says, it's over. This is done. You ceasefire, we're moving on. And so Israel's waiting for that to happen, and it's just not happening. So they're like, as long as you keep filling up our ammo dumps, we're going to keep unleashing them.
Right, and then just again on the, look, we'll just continue in this because I just think in every single one of these, it is so calibrated. And this isn't about me. This is about the fact that there is a lot of reams of polling data that's still the number one hang-up that people have about Kamala. They're like, yeah, I think you did better in the debate. But what do you really stand for? What are you going to do? Are you a shapeshifter? Are you a chameleon? There are actually a sizable part of the electorate believes that she is too liberal compared to Trump being, quote, too conservative. And on the issue of the border, that's perhaps no more where she is less out of step with the overall American public. So here she is now being pressed on a lot of immigration flip-flops by this administration. Let's take a listen.
You recently visited the southern border and embraced President Biden's recent crackdown on asylum seekers. And that crackdown produced an almost immediate and dramatic decrease in the number of border crossings. If that's the right answer now, why didn't your administration take those steps in 2021?
The first bill we proposed to Congress was to fix our broken immigration system, knowing that if you want to actually fix it, we need Congress to act. It was not taken up. Fast forward to a moment when a bipartisan group of members of the United States Senate, including one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, got together, came up with a border security bill. Well, guess what happened? Donald Trump got word that this bill was afoot and could be passed, and he wants to run on a problem instead of fixing a problem. So he told his buddies in Congress, kill the bill, don't let it move forward.
But I've been covering the border for years. And so I know this is not a problem that started with your administration.
Correct.
But there was an historic flood of undocumented immigrants coming across the border the first 3 years of your administration. As a matter of fact, arrivals quadrupled from the last year of President Trump. Was it a mistake to loosen the immigration policies as much as you did?
It's a long-standing problem. And solutions are at hand. And from day one, literally, we have been offering solutions.
What I was asking was it a mistake to kind of allow that flood to happen in the first place?
I think the policies that we have been proposing are about fixing a problem, not promoting a problem. Okay?
But the numbers did quadruple.
And the numbers
under your
today,
watch.
because of what we have done, we have cut the flow of illegal immigration by half.
But should you have done
cut
that?
the
Should you
flow
have
of
done that?
fentanyl by half, but we need Congress to be able to act to actually fix the problem.
See, I love that clip because anytime he talks about any executive action, it's a long-standing problem. Then anytime that there has been a reduction as a result of reverse of previous executive action, then you're taking credit for it. Well, which one is it? You know, what is the causal link between all of that? And again, what I come through with a lot of that, and look, I care a lot about the border issue and immigration, et cetera. So I am trying to take my hat off and look at this from the swing state voter, somebody who is looking at this issue and be like, hey, how are you thinking about this? I don't think there's a coherence to this. Now everyone will be like, oh, but Trump, there's no coherence. Now, actually though, if you look in the rambling and all of that, there is a pretty consistent through line about what Donald Trump thinks about immigration. Yeah. You know, other issues I think you could fairly criticize, but on that, you know, and that one people care a lot about. I don't see that in this at all. It's just a complete muddle. And actually I think that's the through line of all three of these things that we just took a look at. It's like, what do you actually believe? What are you going to do? And in every single one, it was a flub.
And this one, she's just completely screwed by the trajectory of the Democratic Party over the last 5 years. There's probably been no issue on which they have swung this much. Because in the 2000s and 2010s, they were actually fairly tough on immigration. They torpedoed for political.
Rhetorically, they were.
But they also torpedoed for political reasons a comprehensive bill because they wanted to make Republicans out to be the party of nativists. Obama was dubbed the deporter-in-chief by immigration groups. Obama had kids in cages in 2014, 2015, and 2016. This was not an open border, humane immigration policy coming from Obama. Then Trump comes in with his nativist rhetoric and Stephen Miller and all these guys. And so Democrats then all of a sudden put up signs in every front yard across America that says, immigrants are welcome, and that that we're a nation of immigrants. And so they went from fairly moderate to pretty far to the left, historically speaking, for Democrats. And then the second that Biden gets into office, and you have Title 42, and you have the end of the kind of COVID-era policies, and you have a surge at the border, when that becomes a political problem, they swing way to the right. So you're asking any politician to defend that whiplash from center to left to right is going to be impossible when you have kind of executive action at your fingertips that not only can you take, but you did take. So if they had never swung to the right on immigration, she would have a much better answer for that question. Like,
right.
We're consistently, we support, we're pro-immigrant. Like, we believe that we are a nation of immigrants and that immigrants strengthen our country. Democrats decided they're not going to be that party. And when they abandon it, Democrats, as a voting bloc, as a public, also abandon it. And so now support for immigrants is at like 20% or something.
So I don't know. I know this is a convenient leftist narrative, but I still think there's a reality issue. You have tens of millions more people who are here illegally under that administration. The reality people woke up, and this whole it's not about the philosophy of immigrant. It's like, well, what type to what system people want order, and the disorder of it is frankly what changed the status quo. The real problem far more than any change in position.
And maybe we agree with this. I don't know. The real problem here was the end of the guest worker program.
I don't agree with that. Anyway, continue.
We don't have enough American workers, especially to do all the rebuilding that's going to be necessary in Tennessee and North Carolina and Florida. In the 80s, we ended our guest worker programs. We had this idea that people, everyone in the world just wants to live here, and that they don't actually want to live in Mexico or El Salvador or Nicaragua or wherever they're from. But in fact, their actual preference is if they could come here for 4 or 5 months, make enough money to send back to their family, and then go home to their families and live where they're from. That's actually their preference. A well-regulated guest worker program where people are protected, given labor protections, treated fairly, but able to come and go, creates a much more rational system in a world where you have this much inequality between two different countries. When you build a wall and you say you can no longer go back home, then they send for their families. Well, and then you get what we've got.
But Ryan, presumptive in all of this is a very, very low wage, and that's part of the issue. Look, we can't get into this debate because we got our election forecaster.
You like housing prices being affordable, right?
Yes, I do. I also want people to be able to get paid who are American citizens.
What's a good wage if you're in El Salvador?
I don't care about El Salvador. El Salvador's problems and wages are its own problems. And by the way, they fixed a lot of those problems by locking up every single one of their gang members, but that's a separate issue. Like I said, our election forecaster's here. Otherwise, we would go at it for the next 30 minutes. Logan Phillips, let's get him in here. Very excited to be joined now by Logan Phillips, our partner here, Race to the White House for election forecast. As a reminder, some of this will be behind the paywall up until later, so breakingpoints.com. You can take advantage with BP 2024 if you want that discount. But let's start with something that really caught our attention here, Logan, which is Polymarket, the largest betting place for the election, saw a significant swing in odds towards Donald Trump yesterday. Let's put that up on the screen. Trump, as of yesterday, was leading some 8.6% in the odds. That was actually his biggest lead since Kamala Harris entered the race. I want to ask you to opine on betting, and we are not giving any financial advice here on the show. How does that comport with your forecast? Is that overly rosy? How do you look at it?
Well, a few years ago, people were saying that maybe this is going to be the most predictive way to understand what's going to happen in elections because, people are going to care a lot about where they put their money.
Yes.
I think 2022 proved that's not necessarily the case. I think what it shows is what the people that choose to bet on politics will think about the election.
Oh, I like that. Yes.
And the problem is it's hard for us to say exactly who that's going to be. I think it tends to lean right. Specifically college-educated right, more establishment. So you're going to see way higher odds from Ron DeSantis than made sense back in the GOP primary.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Okay.
And higher odds for Republicans. Now,
has anybody polled that? Because that's an answerable question.
Well, but the problem here is these is all crypto, so it's like
they're not going to.
I mean, listen, Polymarket's not even legal technically in America, so you need a VPN. I'm not going to give any instructions, but just in terms of the way that it all gets done, it's not all that easy for the general public. But that's a really interesting point. Can you talk more about 2022? What were some of the observations you saw ahead of that?
Yeah, so going into 2022, the odds that this might have something to it seemed higher. But if all the polls are missing to the left, that means anything that's missing to the right is going to look better than it might actually be as an indicator. So in 2022, the narrative overrated Republicans and they overrated them significantly more. And so all of these Senate races, people thought Republicans were going to win that they didn't win.
Right.
And it just showed, this is an imperfect measure.
That's a fantastic point, especially with the more recency of political betting markets and this one and two. And we shouldn't forget, it's $1 billion market or so. It sounds like a lot. It's actually not that big if you think about the stock market or anything else with corrective forces. And everybody knows even though those are not all that accurate. Let's go to the next one because that was on Pennsylvania. This was another one where I wanted your input. They're showing a 56-44 spread towards Donald Trump in the state of Pennsylvania, some 12-point swing, in the betting market. So just from a polling level, where does Pennsylvania actually stand right now?
Oh, it's lightly favoring Harris.
Really?
I would say about 60% chance in my model. Most are about the same. There definitely wasn't anything in the last week. I think in my model, the polls got a little better. I haven't added the New York Times ones yet.
Better for Harris?
No, they got a little better for Trump.
Better for Trump,
Post-debate thing faded. But we're talking in my model, at least, from Harris had a 59, 60% chance to win. Now it's 57.
Wow.
So that's a very small reduction.
Yeah, it's very, very small. You just mentioned there the New York Times polls. They just came out this morning, and perhaps we'll delve into it a little bit more. But, just to get your general analysis, I think what we have from them is likely voters. They show Kamala with 49%, Donald Trump at 46%. This is likely voters at the national level. Is that enough of a national popular vote lead to be able to win the election? Because you can win the popular vote, as we all know, and still lose the Electoral College.
Well, I was just reading Nick Cohen's results in my Uber over here this morning, and he makes the argument, which I tend to agree with, that the polls suggest Harris is underperforming a bit in some of the blue states like New York. Perhaps is underperforming in Florida as well. At least that's what their polls show, even though others don't.
Yeah.
And so she might have an electoral college advantage because she appears, as Democrats did, to be gaining in places like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, at least relative to where the popular vote was.
Yeah.
So, we saw that in 2022. If you had the popular vote tied, isn't Democrats doing slightly better, and you just look at the House vote, they would have won enough to easily win the Electoral College. I believe that would have even included North Carolina, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada. Now, it doesn't appear as strong this cycle as it did in 2022, but it looks notably better than it did in 2020 and 2016, and a little bit better than 16. Now, will that happen in reality? We don't know, but the two metrics we can look at, 2022 and the current polling, suggest that's the case at least.
So let's talk about that. So you talked about Florida there. They show Trump up by some 13 points. That actually fits with something we really, really wanted to talk to you about, which is this bet that Nate Silver has made. Guys, let's put that up on the screen, please. That's C3. So Keith Raboy, he's a billionaire down in the state of Florida. He bet Nate Silver $100,000 that Trump, so Nate said, how much money are you willing to bet on a Trump plus 8-point spread in Florida? Keith says $100,000. Nate says drop a contract and let's do it. So would you have taken that action? And keep in mind, this is before the New York Times poll that shows Trump up by 13 points. What do you think? Wise bet or not?
Well, it's not a bet I would have taken.
Okay, all right.
I think part of that might have to do with the fact that Race to the White House might be doing fairly well, but it's not doing as well as Nate Silver. Right, So I don't know if I have the $100K laying around for this bet.
Okay, let's say you had $10 million.
$10 million. Well, I love this question. Now. Well, let's make this a thing.
All right, $10 million. So what is that? 1% of your net worth, something
1%,
like that?
Oh, I would have made it at the time Nate Silver made it.
Okay, all right, there we go.
I still think it's most likely going to be under 8.
Yeah.
This New York Times poll is a giant outlier. And to be fair, for most of this cycle, New York Times has been the outlier.
Yes.
Now, I don't want to be, beating the same drum too much because I've said this before on the show. They're an amazing pollster, but they also have been consistently missing to the right. So most likely, then reality will miss to the right unless they're seeing something everyone else isn't.
Let's editorially, let's just make sure, because people are like, wait, New York Times to the right? How does that work? So we're not talking about editorial, like they have a balance. You're talking specifically about their polling
Just the polling this particular cycle.
Their polling has missed. It's been too favorable to Republicans over the years.
Just this year, and I'm not even sure if it's wrong. It just probably is because all the polls combined are worth a lot more than New York Times, as great as the New York Times polling record is, right? So they're clearly seeing an electorate that's a lot more favorable to Trump. Their read on Florida is that the state has shifted since COVID measurably, which is buyable, that people just decided to move there who wanted to escape regulations. In general, people have been moving. There's immigration that can move a state left, and there's also migration that can move a state left and right. And in Florida's case, the immigration from Cuba can also move it right as well,
Totally.
right?
Good point.
So we don't really know yet for Florida which one it's going to be. I think it's possible pollsters, if this is actually happening, might underrate it, because sort of the cheap shortcut for pollsters sometimes is to say, hey, let's find an electorate and ask them how they voted in 2020, and we're going to have the electorate be reflective of what happened in 2020. So if it was an R+3 state, we'll show it R+3. Now, off the cuff, I don't remember exactly how Florida voted to the decimal point or anything, but it definitely appeared in 2022 to move to the right. And so if that is a result of a different voter base, then yeah, some of these pollsters might be underrating Trump there.
Now, so North Carolina and Florida are, well, North Carolina was devastated by a hurricane. Florida's about to be devastated by a hurricane. 20 years ago, when Republicans were the party of the upper middle class, the people who had their ducks in a row, had their IDs out, had been voting at the same polling location for decades because they'd owned their home for 30 years at this point, like they were the ones that would benefit in an unstable environment. That's why today, like at the time, polls of likely voters benefited Democrats, whereas registered voters voted Democrats. Likely voters benefited Republicans because they were more likely to go out to vote. From that, you saw all these like voter restriction, ID, et cetera, et cetera. Now that's flipped. You got a lot of working class support for Republicans. They're more itinerant voters, less likely necessarily to show up in a difficult circumstance. Florida and North Carolina have extremely difficult circumstances when it comes to voting. So is that going to help Democrats who are now the party of the upper middle class, who are kind of know where their ID is, know where their voting location is, et cetera? I mean, it's completely unpredictable, but what would you guess if you had to at this point?
That's such a tough question. It's entirely possible. I would also say, though, that part of this is how the government responds. Now, North Carolina GOP, more so than most parties who are in control of the state, have been willing to play some electoral games to get advantages, like redrawing the maps. But if they're going to do whatever they can to get their voters exactly what they need to be able to vote. So I think you'll see some marshaled effort by the state to ensure that doesn't happen, at least in more of the white working class areas.
Yeah.
Though it might happen across the board. I don't want to accuse someone of something they haven't done yet, right? So that might mitigate it to a degree. I think above all else, though, it's going to be more of a sentiment effect. And we don't know how voters are going to view the response by these politicians. On average,
pissed off, right?
They're going to be upset. And here's where I'm concerned to a degree, right? Because when bad political incentives get in the way of what needs to happen, that's where there's some danger.
Yeah.
I'm worried about the House not giving the funding needed to have a good response here, because making the Biden-Harris administration look bad might be worth it for them. I'm not saying that's true for most Republicans,
right,
but given the way the House usually works, is that they need the majority of the majority to agree, or you need an outright majority of House members to agree,
right.
And you only have like 6 to spare, and there's way more than 6 who are willing to play those types of games.
That's a good point.
But what you also want in that moment is a leader who can command the respect of the entire country, who can,
Yeah, that's right.
Do we have that?
I don't know. Here, let's move on to the Senate, actually, because on the state level, you're getting to something that's really important. As a reminder, this is going behind the paywall, guys. You'll be able to watch it later, but for our premium subscribers, they can continue watching.
It's going to be good stuff, so you better.
It is great stuff.
Better subscribe.
Thank you, Ryan. Let's go ahead and put your forecast up on the screen here, Logan. So you have a race to the White House for the Senate. Explain what we are looking at here in terms of safety, safe R, and some of those lighter states, and which way that you think that they're going to go. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say the framework in the beginning is if Democrats win the White House, they need 50 seats, because just like last time around with Vice President Harris, it'd be Tim Walz acting as the tiebreaker. Republicans only need 50 if they win the White House. If Republicans win the White House, they've probably got it locked down because West Virginia is going to be a flip for them. But if Democrats win the White House, they have a shot here, right? So when I'm talking about, as you asked about what these meetings, what the ratings mean, Democrat held are for seats and Republican held that are already locked in. There's a lot more Democrats running for re-election. That's why the GOP has an inherent advantage in this map. Safe races are ones that are 95% plus chance to win. Likely are 85% plus. Lean is 75% plus. tilt to 65%. Toss-up is where neither side has at least a 65% chance of winning.
Got it. So let's go to the next part, and this is on the chance, like you were talking about. This is the chance to win a Senate majority. So you actually have it relatively high, with 41.5%, and the projected seats won right now is 48.9 for Democrats, 51.1 for Republicans. 41 is higher, actually, than I've seen previously. So talk to us about the individual races where if we were to see a D win, what that would look like.
Yeah, I get a little queasy when my model's a little different from the conventional wisdom sometimes because I like to be right. But there's not many models like mine this time, but most of them, with one exception from Split Ticket, tend to show it around 35 to 42% chance for Dems.
Yeah.
So I do think it's in play. So the reason why it's gotten more competitive is Nebraska, out of nowhere, appears to be on the political map.
Yes.
Now, I've never seen this big of a gap in my own forecast. The fundamentals of the race say the GOP is going to win the race by 30 points. The polling shows the independent candidate, who may or may not caucus with Democrats, Dan Osborne, leading by a little over 1%.
He's been on the show, too. He's an interesting character.
And we covered his race a year ago.
That's right, you did.
We're the first national press to take this race seriously. I think he probably does caucus with Democrats, but he can ask for the absolute world, like if he is the deciding vote. For him to matter, though, Republicans have to win Montana. Right. So let's do Montana first. Like, John Tester has won 3 straight elections by 4 digits, right? Less than 5,000 votes, I think, each time. What's it looking like for him this time?
Yeah, what happened?
So he is down in the polls, not by that much, if you adjust for the fact that almost every single poll we have there is for Republican internal, and my model tends to think that if it's an internal from either party, you got to adjust heavily for bias.
Yeah.
The limited non-internal polling hasn't been good for Tester, but there's so little of it, and it's mostly out of date that I feel like we're riding blind here. This is just a tough state to win. It's a lot more red than Ohio, right? So even though Tester's one of the strongest political candidates running in the country in terms of overperforming his state, he's got the tougher road to victory. I think he's got a shot, at least 35% chance right now.
The fact that he's not putting out internals suggests that maybe he doesn't have very good ones.
Yeah, he doesn't have internals that he's publishing.
Would he be putting, like, historically, has he put out internal polls to show that he's tight?
I don't believe so, and I don't think it's actually as important because he's going to get the funding. I'm sometimes surprised that of late there's some GOP firms that seem to think it really helps them to have all these internals that show their candidates ahead. I think it actually, if anything, hurts mildly. I don't think really it matters because the person that are going to decide to vote or not decide to vote, they're not looking at the polls.
Yeah, that's right.
So, okay, back to Nebraska then. So, very strong chance it all comes down to Nebraska.
I wouldn't go as far as that. I would say there's a small, maybe 5 to 10% chance it comes down to Nebraska.
Well, why is that? Because you've got Sherrod Brown probably going to win, right? Casey's going to win.
Sherrod Brown probably.
Well, see, that I want to focus on. Let's go to the next one because you have the individual chances there, and I want to talk through this because this is where it all matters. So Arizona, that looks like it's going to stay blue with Gallego. You've got Rick Scott up by some 3%.
Oh, this is just the polling.
Sorry, in the polling in terms of their projected lead. But you have Montana there, she at plus 4.9, but here Osborne at 1.5. So in this scenario, like you were just saying, with Sherrod Brown, I'm being curious because I haven't seen as much focus on that. Sherrod Brown obviously is a strong Democratic candidate. This is what, an R+8 state or whatever, but it's still, things are a lot more partisan and a lot tighter. And the Browns and the Montanas of the world, like, it's a little bit more difficult this time around to actually hang on in those states. What do you think?
Yeah, well, just one quick. So I do think Nebraska, that Fisher is favored. I think I have her up 7.
Okay.
But the reason I give such a chance of an upset is, like, there's this massive gap between the polling and the forecast, and that suggests there's something that could go wrong and raises the odds of an upset.
Right.
So in Ohio's case, Brown has led every poll, but I think 1 or 2, and he's led all the serious polls, or almost all the serious polls. One of which I think New York Times had him up 4. And I think the reason is, hey, Brown's a really good candidate that overperforms with white working class voters, there's a lot of them in Ohio. That's why Democrats have fallen way behind in Ohio, because that group has been moving towards Republicans fast.
That's right.
But Brown is a much better fundraiser than his opponent, which, while the national GOP is coming in to help, that's a real sign he's running a better campaign. And he's also running against a guy that's a car dealer, that's kind of grumpy sometimes. He doesn't always come across as particularly warm and fuzzy.
Moreno.
I think he was by far the weakest candidate.
Who wants a grumpy car dealer?
Exactly. Of any of the primary candidates. And this is the problem that being a Republican, if you sign up for Donald Trump again, that's the cost you go for. Is Donald Trump would like to win the Senate, but above all else, he wants loyalty from the Senate.
Yeah.
He saw the GOP senators that broke against him on impeachment, broke against him on many other things too. That was kind of the backbone of the GOP resistance, even though they were a lot more quiet about it than Adam Kinzinger. They constantly challenged him. And so his goal is to kind of reshape it in his image, so he's not choosing the best candidates.
What I remember reading also about Ohio is that Sherrod Brown is going hard on abortion, especially after that abortion referendum. So could you talk about abortion here on the Senate level? How much does that factor into the Gallego strength with the Arizona law? How much does it factor into Ohio and to the general statewide races that you're seeing?
It's definitely a helpful issue. It's not going to win the races alone, but if it can pass, if abortion referendums can pass even in very red Kansas by 20 points, they're going to pass in every state in the country except maybe Louisiana and Mississippi and maybe Alabama. So it's just become a real advantage issue for Democrats. I think Gallego, though, who's just dominating the polling.
Dominating.
I think there's two reasons. One, Gallego has a really compelling story.
Yeah.
He came to the U.S. as an immigrant, slept on the floor, worked his way into Harvard, and rather than getting a lot of money, he served in the military. And then Lake used to be pretty even with voters back in 2022, but her years-long campaign to try to overturn the election, after a certain point, it just looked kind of silly, and no one liked hearing about Cyber Ninja and all this other stuff and it being a national story. You saw her favorable ratings hit the basement afterwards. They've recovered a little bit, but they're still really bad. I think this is a very different Kari Lake in terms of Arizona voters' perception than the razor-tight race in 2022.
Got it. And so overall, you look at the Senate. Texas, I forgot to ask. So there's a lot of hay being made right now in Washington, calling all red. There's Republicans who are backing him. You have it as likely red. I mean, I'm from Texas. I still think Ted Cruz is probably going to win, but what explains the mania? Why are they hopeful this time around?
I think it's justified, not because he's necessarily favored, which I don't think, but because there's an argument to be made that Texas could continue to shift.
Okay.
I mean, the state voted, I think, 20 points for Romney, and then it voted 5.5 points for Trump in 2020, so it's moving at a pretty fast clip.
Yeah, it's changing a lot. Right.
So if it continues to have another jump like it did in 2020 to the left, and he just overperforms Harris by a few points, and she does well nationally and in Texas, or at least keeps it there, loses by 2 or less, I think it's possible. I think the other reason is, right, like just broadly speaking, if Democrats lose Montana, they have to win either Florida, Texas, or Nebraska. Yeah, the polling is good in Nebraska, but it's so unlikely that we're kind of just like waiting for the shoe to drop, and it may not happen.
I feel like it's more likely than Florida or Texas, though.
I was going to say, do you really think that Florida and Texas are more in play than Nebraska? I mean, those are just again, look, I could be wrong, but these are just locked in red states to me.
Well, Nebraska's like, 25 points to the right of the country?
I don't know.
So Florida and Texas used to be that state. It's now like 10 points in 2020 to the right. If it becomes like 6 points, 5 points, and Harris wins by 4 nationally, you could see it happening.
What about Omaha? Who's moving there? Are those right-wing Californians or left-wing Californians?
Or are they even Californians?
Are they Californians?
Who are they?
Who's leading to the growth in Omaha?
I actually don't know that off the top. That's a good
I haven't
question.
looked at the internal migration data.
But I'll tell you this.
If you live in Omaha, let us know.
I would say, one area that Democrats have struggled on a policy level in cities more than any other has been affordable housing.
Yes.
They're starting to shift and take it more seriously, but the bizarre, unexpected, huge upside for Democrats nationally is people keep moving to swing states because that's where a lot of the growth has been lately. That's what's making some of these states like Arizona into swing states.
New conspiracy theory just dropped.
What?
Democrats have pushed up housing prices to push their blue voters into swing states.
I don't even think that's a conspiracy theory. I think it's just actually true.
That's what happens.
It
doesn't mean that
happening.
On the system is what it does.
So I wanted to ask you about split ticket voters. That was another thing. So Gallego up by 8, but then I see Trump. How much is Trump up in your forecast in Arizona? Or
I think in the projection, it's like 1.5 points. Polling might be about the same.
Okay, so do you really believe 10% of the electorate are split ticket voters? I just find it crazy.
Well, I'm not going to say with confidence because these things can always be off, right?
Yeah.
They're going to be off in some direction.
Right.
But yeah, I think voters. We were at a historical low point in 2020 in terms of split ticket voters. An object in motion in politics doesn't always stay in motion, right?
Yeah, right.
That's a really low point, and it kind of makes sense. It could return to the norm a little bit. We saw in 2022 in particular candidates who are not named Donald Trump that have a record of trying to overturn elections. Boy, voters don't like that.
Congratulations to Kari Lake of being the candidate who people are like, Trump, I'm all right with.
Right, but not
Kari Lake, wow.
Can't deal with that. Yeah, it is fast. So the Gallego Trump voter, you think it's real? You think it's very real?
Yeah, I mean, especially if Trump is gaining a bit with Latinos, which, to be fair, in Arizona, he didn't do as much in 2020.
Yeah, he did not.
We'll see if it happens in 24, but Gallego makes sense that as a guy who grew up in poverty, and there's a lot of first, second, third generation immigrants from Mexico as well there, that he could do better because, boy, is his story compelling, and they can see themselves or their parents or their grandparents in it.
All right, well, we'll see. Logan, I always love talking to you, man. You're such a great wealth of information. Race to the White House, is it .org or .com? I forget.
.com.
.com. All right, racetothewhitehouse.com. We'll have a link down in the description. We love having a partnership with you, so we will see you soon.
Hey, great to be on again. Love being on, too. See you soon.
During her 60 Minutes interview, Kamala Harris was also asked a question that it seems like she wasn't quite ready for. And you might not be ready for the answer here. Let's take a listen.
Which foreign country do you consider to be our greatest adversary?
I think there's an obvious one in mind, which is Iran. Iran has American blood on their hands, okay? This attack on Israel, 200 ballistic missiles. What we need to do to ensure that Iran never achieves the ability to be a nuclear power, that is one of my highest priorities.
So if you have proof that Iran is building a nuclear weapon, would you take military action?
I'm not going to talk about hypotheticals at this moment.
I'm sorry, what?
What? I've been upset about this basically from the moment that I saw this because
this was not in the interview, it was in the overtime part.
First of all, why didn't they put that in there? That's an insane thing to say. So we're talking about a regional power, non-nuclear state, maybe nuclear, that threatens that is the right answer if your name is Israel. If you're the president of the United States, look, even within the liberal framework, say Russia. Russia is a stupid answer too, but you can make a case for it, right? It's got nukes. It invaded Ukraine. All right, I still think that's not all that high priority in their idiotic worldview.
Years of being scared
I get
of them.
it.
So you
exactly. You got boomers who are worried about, I
Russians in the closet,
drills or whatever. Okay, so I get that. I still think it's an incredibly dumb answer, but Iran, and notice that she said it's our greatest threat. She talks about American blood on their hands. I assume that she's talking about those proxy attacks on U.S. soldiers, 3 killed in that Jordanian attack recently, and then previously the war in Iraq. But then she starts talking about Israel. Oh, hold on a second. You said our greatest adversary, not Israel's greatest adversary. I mean, that is honestly one of the most troubling answers I have ever heard from a presidential candidate, because what does that mean for your worldview of what you think adversary to the United States is? Not to Israel. I'm not voting for the president of Israel. I'm supposed to be voting for the president who's looking at our commerce. I mean, like I just said, you could make a fine case for Russia. I still think it's dumb. China's the most obvious answer. Even within that, I mean, Biden says China, right? Like, what are we doing here with Iran?
Yeah, I think she treated it as a pop quiz, didn't know the answer, and reached for one.
Oh my God!
Like, I don't think she actually believes that Iran is our biggest threat. How cool, though, would it be to have a president who said none? Oh, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Yeah, honestly, that'd be a better answer. Again, I don't agree with that necessarily, but yeah, I could make a philosophical case, in one where America is so powerful that our own division and lack of unity is a threat to us, to global instability and to other nations. In fact, I don't not believe that, but I just think that they're, within the framework of greatest adversary. But I just have no idea how you arrive at Iran. Also notice, Ryan, she didn't even think about it. She immediately went to it. It's like, if you look back at those previous debates, and I said this on Twitter, I was like, I honestly think that is the stupidest answer to this question in several decades. During the Cold War, it was not really that difficult. The only time where it's ever been in flux is that 2012 famous debate, Romney and Obama, where Romney says Russia and Obama correctly makes fun of him. He's like, well, we don't have bayonets anymore, Mr. Romney, and all that. And Obama was right, by the way, because he said China. But, in the year of our Lord, 2024, to say Iran is so crazy. Like, again, we are not talking about a nation that in any way, like when you say greatest adversary, you are talking about global competition. You are talking about somebody who poses a genuine existential threat to the superpower. There's only one nation in the world for which that's not even 100% true, but you can make a case for it, and that's China. That's why the Russia one is so dumb, and that's why Iran, I mean, again, we're talking about shipping lanes. Okay, fine, you know, little damage to the U.S. economy. Not even saying it would be good. It would be, I think it would be a disaster, you know, for to get into a war with Iran. But to say our greatest adversary, they're doing backflips in Beijing. They're doing backflips in Moscow over this. If you're so dumb that you think that, I can't help you.
I think the actual answer to this is that our greatest adversary is ourselves, our own military adventurism, our recklessness, and also our sanctions policy, which Jeff Stein has covered so well. Our sanctions policy, which is going to eventually drive the rest of the world to stop using the dollar, which is the main thing.
I think that's a fine answer, and the reason why, again, is fine is it acknowledges like superpower status, and it's like actually the only threat to us is ourselves because we're so big, we're so powerful that only our own missteps can lead us into disaster, which is true. I mean, if you look at Iraq and all, nobody could have damaged America more than the American invasion of Iraq. But yeah, I mean, I just ideologically, framework-wise, to talk about Iran, I mean, also, when you say our greatest adversary, at least on Russia and China, we have a limiting principle of war called nuclear weapons. Like, at the end of the day, that stops it from escalating into the worst areas. With Iran, they don't have nukes, at least not yet. And we're on the precipice of a potential Israeli strike on nuclear facilities or even oil facilities, which could lead to blowback. That actually could lead to a full-blown hot war, which would draw the United States in almost certainly. So is that what we're setting the stage here? I mean, that's the crazy part too.
The latest leaks out of Israel are that they have decided not to target the nuclear sites because they're inside of a mountain and they can't do it. And we paid them off, begged them not to do it. Instead, they're going to attack the oil industry, which Iran has said it will respond by attacking Saudi, Iraq, and other oil fields throughout the Middle East and just setting the entire thing on fire. So we'll see how that goes. We have an interesting example of our own recklessness that I was referring to over at Dropsite. If you can put up this element here. Our correspondent over in Israel, Yaniv Kogan, writes this piece. Blinken-approved policy to bomb aid trucks, Israeli cabinet members suggest.
Wow.
And that might sound crazy. Go read the story. I'll put the link in the description down below. What Yaniv identified here is that at October 16th and 17th, into the early morning hours of the 17th, Secretary of State Blinken goes to Israel. So this is 10 days after the attack, and humanitarian aid has been cut off to Gaza. The first thing that Netanyahu says to him is that, look, I can't actually lift this siege. I've got people in my cabinet who don't want a bottle of aspirin getting into Gaza. And he says, I will negotiate this with Biden, not with you. And Blinken says, Biden's not getting on a plane and coming to visit here unless you change this policy.
Okay.
And so Blinken thinks that bluster is going to move Netanyahu. He meets him 6 hours later. Netanyahu still hasn't moved. So what Yanni reports here, Blinken sits down with the security cabinet of Israel, and they hash out a humanitarian aid policy. And the policy that they finally agreed to is that, okay, we will let in some aid trucks, not through Israel. We'll let them come in through Egypt. Egypt has to basically let us monitor everything that's going in. And if we believe that there is any Hamas involvement with any of these aid convoys, we are allowed to strike those convoys. And Blinken then signs off on those. And one of the key pieces of evidence of this, the first draft was published in English, which is, the kind of a giveaway is going back and forth between Blinken. And the word that they use to thwart, they say we will thwart it if it's connected to Hamas. We will thwart the convoy, is the same Hebrew word, Yanni points out, that they often use to describe assassinations. So thwart they're clear about what's going on here. The State Department's spokesperson, Matthew Miller, was asked by Saeed Erekat yesterday about this report at the State Department briefing. Let's take a listen to that.
Let me ask you about a report in Dropsite. And it says that Secretary Blinken approved a policy to bomb aid trucks That's what an Israeli cabinet member said. Are you aware of this report, and do you have any comment on it?
I am aware of the report. I'm glad you asked me about it. Look, the suggestion that we in any way signed off on bombing humanitarian convoys is absurd. It's just not true. Of course, Israel has the right to target Hamas militants. That has always been the case. And so look, if you had a situation where Hamas commandeered a convoy and Hamas militants were operating a convoy, of course Israel would have the right to strike those militants. That's not been the situation that we've seen over the past year, except in some very limited circumstances. There have been a few reports here and there of Hamas commandeering convoys, in most cases returned quickly to the humanitarian organizations. It has not been, there's not been any widespread evidence that we have seen of Hamas actually taking convoys and commandeering them, which is, I think, the scenario, or the proposition of this scenario presumes. So the strikes that Israel has conducted on humanitarian convoys have been times when they have had failures in their deconfliction processes, where they have had intelligence failures, and when they've just made basic mistakes. And the thing that we have made clear about those is that those mistakes are unacceptable, and that humanitarian workers need to be protected, and humanitarian aid needs to be protected. So the idea that anyone at this department signed off on bombing humanitarian convoys is just absolutely ridiculous.
So if you notice there, Saagar, he starts by calling the report absurd, but then throughout the answer, he basically confirms the report that if Israel believes that Hamas is involved with these convoys, then of course they have the right to strike it. That rationale is, of course, the one that the IDF has used each time it has struck a convoy. If you think back to the World Central Kitchen attack that killed all those aid workers, they said, well, we thought that there were a couple Hamas militants at some point before it went into the warehouse, and we thought maybe they were still there. Every attack on an aid convoy has used this very rationale. The other policy option available is, you know what, don't attack humanitarian aid convoys. Let's just have that as our policy. Like that's an available policy, and still to this day, not one that the U.S. has insisted on.
I mean, the report itself is, I actually encourage people to go read it. But on the response from Matt Miller, what did you make then of his categorical denial? Or was there room for this within his framework? What did you think of that?
So if you're used to parsing these responses, absurd is a word that they use that's not a categorical denial.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Right, yeah. It's absurd, but it could be true.
Doesn't actually mean it's not true.
That's good.
And then he later says, of course, you know, if Hamas has commandeered an aid convoy, then Israel has a right to strike that. That's what we reported.
Got it.
And so they're confirming that that is the policy. Because like I said, the alternative policy is, we don't care who is driving the aid convoy. You don't strike an aid convoy. You deal, if something happens to an aid convoy, you deal with that later in other ways. The Flower massacre, where 100+ people or so were slaughtered at this intersection, there was a Hamas security official who was in charge of the security around that delivery of the flour. Like, this is often who aid organizations are communicating with, the Hamas police officials. Hamas is the de facto government. So you're going to find Hamas. If you're Israel, you have been saying for years that UNRWA is a front for Hamas. So a low-level or mid-level operative who is behind the button on the drone, UNRWA? Well, we already believe that they're a front for Hamas and thoroughly infiltrated and a terrorist organization that ought to be banned. There's UNRWA. And you see one guy with a gun, like, all right, well, we're going to hit this aid convoy. It also raises the question, who do they want to do security for these aid convoys? Is Blackwater available for business to like start shepherding aid convoys through Gaza? Like, what are they talking about? So the result is that aid convoys get struck. And the result of an aid convoy getting struck is not just that particular flour or water or medicine doesn't get delivered, but then the aid organization itself not only has lost personnel, but usually stops for an extended period of time delivering aid.
What do you make of this in the context of previous stuff you guys have reported about Blinken and his overruling of things within the department?
That he's effectively acted as basically an attorney for like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, like taking their harshest ideological positions and massaging them into something that's acceptable from a U.S. perspective. And I think that if you delved into his heart of hearts or something, what he would be saying is, look, it was either this or abject starvation, because they were telling me that not a single aspirin was going to get in. And I got 50 trucks in, and then the next day there were 60 trucks in. And yes, the result was that some convoys got struck, and that's unfortunate, but the alternative was much worse. So I think that's what they would argue. But on the other hand, it's the greatest superpower in the history of the world that is just getting, walked around by a client state.
That's what underscores to me is like we go through all this bureaucratic BS to like approve all of this Israeli violation of U.S. law, and then you see the same machine kick in to justify anything Ukraine, wants to do. And it's like when you put those two things together, you're like, what are we doing here?
These are choices.
These are explicit choices. These are if anything, it seems to me like Blinken is such a powerful force because Biden is so cooked and so irrelevant that Blinken does run a lot of U.S. foreign policy with respect to these discrete choices. When Biden can coherently be like, just give them whatever they want or whatever. Yeah. But he's the one actually mechanically executing all of this.
There was a new Axios report this morning. I love that new Axios reports.
Yes, absolutely.
4 sources say that Biden is increasingly frustrated and he doesn't trust. Yeah. He doesn't trust that the Israelis are honest brokers when it comes to their talks with him. It's like,
okay, all right, got it. Yeah, very, very useful. Any other plans on the State Department? If you were, when's the next briefing?
Today. Okay. I'll be at it. I was at this one, and I got dissed on the follow up.
What do you want to ask him today?
I don't know. Is that people should tell me what they want to ask. One thing I've been wanting to ask is what happened to the American concern for civilian casualties when Israel bombed this killed a top Hamas commander in 2002. It was 6 months after 9/11.
Oh, you're talking about the Bush administration. I remember this. Yeah.
6 months after 9/11, Islamophobia and fear of terrorists is ripping through the American body politic. They take out a top Hamas commander and kill 8 civilians or so in that strike. The Bush administration loses it on them. This is an unacceptable civilian death toll. Now, you can take out 200 to 300 civilians in a single strike aimed at a top Hezbollah commander. And the answer from the State Department is, well, Hezbollah shouldn't be near all of these civilians.
Right.
Not even a reference in a Lloyd Austin statement or a Blinken statement or a Biden statement or a Harris statement. Not even a line that says that this civilian death toll is unacceptable. What happened? So I'm curious from their perspective, what happened in the 20 years since then to make it so that we're cool with that?
You should ask him that. Yeah. I'd like to see that. I remember I've brought that up before about the Bush administration, how in 2002, even Ari Fleischer, who actually, that's the ironic part. Fleischer said that in 2002, but now he's on Fox News being like, actually, Israel is the most moral army in the history of the world. I'm like, wait, but I know nothing matters, but that's, you said that. Yeah. He'd be like, well, that was President Bush, not me. Yeah, I'm sure
the compassionate conservative.
Amazing. All right, let's move on to Hillary Clinton. This is something I've been wanting to put in the show for quite some time. I actually watched this interview live. I was sitting in the state of Pennsylvania. It was in the morning. My father-in-law keeps CNN on. Don't ask me why, but I was forced to endure this struggle session. And it's funny because it's one of those things where Smirkonish clearly does not realize the magnitude of what actually just was said. But if you're listening carefully, you're like, that's one of the most insane things I've ever heard. So here we have Hillary talking about how imperative it is to censor and to monitor content. Let's take a listen.
There should be a lot of things done. We should be, in my view, repealing something called Section 230, which gave platforms on the internet immunity because they were thought to be just pass-throughs, that they shouldn't be judged for the content that is posted. But we now know that that was an overly simple view, that if the platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter X or Instagram or TikTok, whatever they are, if they don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose total control.
We lose total control. All right. So what do we take away from that, Ryan? We lose total control.
No, who's the we and what are you controlling?
Who's the we? What are you controlling? What are we talking? You know, it's interesting too. We should consider like what the context of this interview actually happens, because it happened within the general context of being asked not necessarily about social media, but about election strife ahead of this election. So that was specifically being talked about in the context of quote unquote misinformation ahead of the current election. And I was thinking, wow, that's very revealing, isn't it? It also gets to the bitterness of Hillary, because you have to remember that the through line for all of this is still Russia 2016. Mm-hmm. And now they've faux intellectualized the argument about all this. And look, you know, the whole Section 230 thing, there's arguments to be made, actually. I've seen from the right, from the left about it, about liability and all that. But if you're making the argument explicitly to say that we need straight up much more criminal liability for platforms for spreading misinformation, that gives the game away in a very certain sense.
Yeah, and it also suggests that she still believes that most of big tech, obviously she feels like Twitter has fallen, but she still feels like most of big tech is susceptible to her pressure.
Yeah.
That there's some alignment there, that they're not doing enough according to her, but she feels like if she makes the case, if Democrats put enough pressure on them, they can. 230 is interesting for people to know. That's the section of the law that says that if you're a platform, basically, let's say you're a comment section, that you are not personally liable. Your company is not liable for something that somebody says in a comment section, because the argument is that you can't have a free-flowing debate of user-generated content if you have to fact-check every single thing that every Tom, Dick, and Harry is putting up on your site. The argument against it is that that was the case when platforms were neutral, and that everybody had an equal chance, and that the published product of that platform was the sum of the parts of the voices that were allowed to flow freely into it. So the argument is, if you're no longer balanced and your algorithm is pushing something far to the left or pushing something far to the right or driving a particular narrative, then you are actually a publisher, and you no longer should have the shield of 230. Let's say, to take Twitter for example, if they can prove that like Musk like goes in and puts his thumb on the scale, or old Twitter, if with old Twitter you could prove that they were going in and putting their thumb on the scale and pushing it in Biden's direction on the Hunter Biden story or whatever else, then you would say, well, actually, that's not protected. And you now can be sued for defamation.
I just think the context of this, well, actually, you know what? We never got to talk, because that also came after that Tim Walz clip from the debate. We haven't spent enough time. We all had to move on. But okay, as a leftist, give us the take on why Tim Walz was wrong.
Shocking from Tim Walz. Well, first of all, he did the stupid,
can't yell fire in a
crowded theater.
Which is fake. Yeah, it's actually incorrect.
If there's a fire, you absolutely can.
Right.
And if you yell fire in a crowded theater and you do not cause panic, then that also is fine. Like, you're allowed to do that.
Right. This is a commonly cited thing. I don't know what the origins of it even are.
It was in a Supreme Court. It was in a Supreme Court ruling where he was saying, like, obviously, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater and cause falsely.
That's right.
Falsely.
That's right. And
you can't falsely yell fire in a crowded theater and to cause panic. So you need all of those different elements. You have to know it's false, and you have to cause panic. And they were using it to lock up socialists who were calling for resistance to the draft.
That's right.
World War I. But they weren't even calling for resistance to the draft. They were telling people to call their member of Congress and argue to repeal the draft law. So, and they locked the head of the Socialist Party up for like 6 months for that, or whatever. So terrible for anybody to point to that in any way. more worrisome, I thought, was what he said right after that. He said, you don't have a right to hate speech.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, actually, you do.
It's like, bro, that's the whole point.
Right.
Like free speech that is just loving speech makes no sense. Who's going to prosecute for loving speech?
Well, it's especially terrifying in the context of all these like democratic current efforts to like institutionalize, the definition of anti-Semitism. What is the IHRA definition, which basically is just, it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel, which is nuts. I mean, and by the way, that fits with a lot of those Republican BDS laws that are already on the books, totally unconstitutional if you.
And outsourcing the definition of something like that to a private organization, which could then go on its website and change it again.
Yeah, the whole thing is crazy. But anyway, I mean, it's alive and well in the censorship industrial complex.
Wasn't it Colombia that said you can't use Zionist in a pejorative way?
That just happened. Yeah, didn't you? You talked about that because, well, Colombia's, it's different. It's private. We can criticize it, but there's not much you can do on an institutional level.
You could say you don't get federal funding.
Yeah, but you made a good point. You were like, wait, but what about in like history classes? Like, what do you
in papers?
Say? It's like in papers, you know, in a literal academic context. But suddenly a lot of those concerns just disappear. And because what we all know is that they really mean it, that if it's in a historical context, it's fine. But if it's in a political context on campus and you don't like it, and especially if the donors don't like it, that's when you're going to get expelled. And that's when it's a problem. Okay, we've got Jefferson Morley standing by, so let's get to it.
All right, joining us today is Jefferson Morley, who's the author of many books on the JFK assassination. Been investigating it for many decades. How long?
30 years.
So 30 years at this point. You have a new piece out, and let's put this up on the screen. This is at his Substack, JFK Facts, which everybody should subscribe to. One thing that Jefferson is known for is almost never relying on anonymous sources. Everything is document-based and people who are willing to put their name to something.
Right.
This latest story is significantly based on an anonymous source, which to me signals how important you think it is.
That's true.
That you're willing to go forward on it. So tell us what this source told you and why this is in advance on what we understand, or at least adds new questions to what we understand about the assassination.
This source approached me a few years ago and said in the course of working at the CIA had seen a document that disturbed them. And so we talked about that. I investigated a little bit, found a lot to corroborate that. I also checked out the source professional expertise, experience, and I felt very confident. This source is highly credible. And I wouldn't, like you say, I rarely use unnamed sources. But in this case, I felt if the source was willing to take a chance of disclosing classified information, then I could take a chance on the source.
Right. Do you feel like that this source will ever come forward? Like, we're going to learn who this is at some point?
I think the sources will be willing to do that.
All right, so let's talk about what they told you.
What did they show you?
The source said two really significant things. One, that there was a file room in a CIA office in Herndon, Virginia, where the CIA keeps its assassination-related records. Now, that doesn't mean that those are all secret records. Those may be records that have been shared with the Congress. We don't know. But that there is a dedicated facility like that. And I did some reporting, talked to people who have worked in that building, one of whom confirmed to me that there was a JFK facility within a SCIF, a secure compartmentalized intelligence facility. And so I felt good about that. The second thing that the source said was that in the course of duties at the CIA, the source had seen a document about the CIA's reaction to the congressional investigation of the 1970s. And the source felt that this document, lengthy document, 40, 50 pages, apparently produced by the CIA Inspector General's office, showed an intent to deceive the congressional investigators. The source says this document shows that they knew they weren't being totally forthcoming, and when Congress didn't penetrate their deception, they celebrated. Now, there's no document like that that's been released in the past 30 years with all the JFK releases under Trump and Biden. There's no document that fits that description in the remaining 3,500 JFK documents that still contain redactions. So this document is not in the JFK collection. Obviously, it should be. One of the important things about the story, and this also made me feel good, was when I asked the CIA for comment, they did not deny any of the facts in the story. In fact, they said something slightly disturbing. If you parse their statement carefully, what they're saying is, we're under no obligation to release this document, and if we want to keep it public, we will.
Got it. And so one of the things you talk about in the story is about Oswald in Mexico.
Yes, and that's the core of what he's talking about. The source says that the House Select Committee was called in and showed a bunch of documents about the CIA surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City shortly before the assassination of President Kennedy.
Right.
The CIA has always said, we never obtained any photographs of Oswald in Mexico City. The source says one of the things that he saw in the JFK file room was what looked like a video case that was labeled Oswald in Mexico and dated 1963. Now, if there is photography of Oswald in Mexico City in the possession of the CIA today, that alone will rewrite the JFK story, because they have been so adamant about denying this over the years. And what you see, the larger point of the story here is that what you see is this fits a pattern of withholding information, closely held information that the CIA had about Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination. And that's what's really going on here, is they are withholding JFK documents to this day. And the source's story makes that story, makes that clear. And the fact that the CIA is not denying it, not saying that, doesn't say the document doesn't exist, doesn't say the facility doesn't exist, we're on to something. So this is really about, why does it matter today? Well, this is about accountability, It's about transparency. We've had these assassination attempts on President Trump, lots of conspiracy theories, politicization of that. Obviously, we need transparency, we need credible investigations around that. And the same goes for President Kennedy. This is a story that doesn't go away in American politics. We're still talking about it 60 years later because of its symbolic importance and because, we have this mistrust of government. Government institutions aren't legitimate. And if you look in the broad sweep of history, when did U.S. government begin to lose its credibility? It was right around 1964, according to the polls, around the Warren Commission report of 1964. Since then, that report, not particularly credible with the American people, confidence in government has been going down.
One of the theories that says, actually there's a theory that says there was no conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy. And in fact, what we're looking at when it comes to CIA is CYA, that they actually are just covering for their own incompetence, and then it snowballs into covering for their cover-up.
Right. And
does this fit that, or does this fit the other?
I think that this points more to complicity because of numerous false statements and the way CIA operations are structured. This looks like a CIA operation, not CIA incompetence. But the available evidence, I have good friends who argue the other way, like you're saying. This is just, they screwed up and they're just covering their asses. Well, that's why we have the JFK Records Act. The JFK Records Act of 1992 says the government has to release all JFK records in its possession. They have to review them and release them. They have a presumption of immediate disclosure, according to the law. So if the CYA explanation is right, that doesn't mean that they don't have to disclose these records. They do have to disclose them. And if that's the case, then they should quell conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorizing and say, we screwed up and here's how we did it. But to say we're innocent and we're not going to share all the records with you, that's not credible.
And so, yeah, in that, let's take people back if they're not all that familiar about Oswald's time in Mexico and the meetings that he allegedly was having there and how that would fit into a conspiracy explanation. Why is that significant, Oswald's time in Mexico?
So Oswald, the accused assassin who denied...
We wrote a book,
He said he was a patsy.
We can put this up, Our Man in Mexico.
Yeah, so the story that I tell in Our Man in Mexico is... Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who will be accused of killing the president and who will deny it and then be killed in police custody, goes to Mexico City 6 weeks before the assassination and visits the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy seeking to get a visa to travel to Cuba.
Right.
The visa request is rejected. He's told he has to go get that in Washington. And so Oswald returns to the United States. What the CIA told the Warren Commission was, we didn't know anything about this guy. We knew so little about him, we didn't even get a picture of him, a surveillance picture of him. As I report in Our Man in Mexico, the station chief in Mexico City, Wynn Scott, said specifically that was not true. He had a very sophisticated surveillance system around both of those. Unlike the CIA's statement that the cameras weren't working that day, false. Investigators established that they were working. And the CIA insists on this, well, we never took his picture. So, in fact, they knew a whole lot about him. Senior CIA officials are looking at Oswald's files 6 weeks before the assassination, writing cables about him, thinking about him, and, by the way, not calling any attention to him, despite the fact that he had been arrested for fighting with CIA-funded group that summer. He had a Russian wife. When he defected to the Soviet Union, he offered military secrets. And now he's visiting Soviet and Cuban diplomatic compound where everybody in those working those compounds was presumed to be an intelligence agent. And most of them in those were, just like a lot of people in the U.S. Embassy were spies.
Of course, yeah.
And so, so the notion that they didn't get his picture was never particularly credible. So what's going on here? Did they just miss him? Well, that would be the CYA. We didn't understand who he was. He went on and shot the president. Sorry, Mrs. Kennedy, we just screwed up. What's hard to understand from our point of view today is, the man who supposedly killed the president was well known to top CIA officials. Imagine if one of these accused assassins with President Trump was well known to a small group of top CIA officials. Would we say that's relevant to the story?
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
The CIA hid all of that. And all of those people who watched Oswald for 4 years as he made his way to Dealey Plaza, none of them lost their job. None of them even got so much as a demerit. Mostly because nobody knew. Over the last 60 years, the story has come out in bits and pieces. And my story now is just the latest part of, we're getting behind that curtain of official secrecy that has always surrounded Oswald and Cuba operations. And when we go through that curtain, we see, oh, there's still more classified stuff behind it.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on today is the CIA saying, we really don't have to obey that law, that law that says all JFK records. We don't really have to obey that. And, the CIA in the constellation of American power, a very strong institution. On JFK records, they got what they wanted, exactly what they wanted, from two very different presidents. From Trump, who said all the JFK records were released in 2017. Wasn't true. He had cut a deal with Mike Pompeo and the CIA, and lots of records remained secret. And Biden, more expectedly, an institutionalist, said, CIA, good guys, they can handle it from here on out. I wash my hands of the matter. So that's where it is right now. Trump's made a little bit of an issue of it, saying he would release the JFK files when RFK endorsed him. Trump had a chance to do it in 2017. He didn't. So it remains to be seen if he's elected, would he do?
Okay, question of why. We always talk about this. All the people involved are dead, presumably. So why do they still care so much about keeping this secret?
Because symbolically, it's really important. And this is why they can't even back up an inch. Because if they said, we screwed up, people get called up to Capitol Hill. They'd ask the director, what's going on here? How did this happen? How come you didn't tell us about this? you know, they might get their budget cut. So yes, all the people involved are dead. And you know, maybe the CIA could say, you know, that was then, this is now. But I think the path of least resistance, and when you have the power of official secrecy, we're just going to bury that. Move along, folks. And, you know, this is what the CIA does. Presidents come and go. Journalists come and go. The CIA is always there. Yeah. And so I think they're thinking, well, you know, we can just wait this thing out.
No, that's all I got. I mean, I guess last thing, if you have a minute, people also point to this police officer who claims that he accidentally squeezed the trigger. I'm sure you've seen this one. What do you think? What do you make of this?
This is the most persistent hoax in the JFK story. The Secret Service man did it.
You're gonna see people in the comment section probably talk about this. So tell us about this.
The claim is that the Secret Service man panicked and turning around accidentally shot the president. The only problem with this theory is there's no eyewitness evidence to support it. There's no forensic evidence to support it. There's no photographic evidence to support it. And the author who first offered this, when facing legal action from one of the Secret Service officers involved, formally retracted the whole thing. So there's no evidence, and it's been renounced by the person who offered it. So chances are there's nothing to it.
Right. Okay.
But I want to say one last thing is, you know, people ask, why does it matter today? What did what was the political meaning of Kennedy's assassination? And I think it's this. This is more my opinion. You can draw your, the facts are the facts. After Kennedy, the most warlike faction in the U.S. government always had the upper hand. And Kennedy was steering us away from that, trying to end the Cold War, not going to war in Cuba, pulling out slowly in Vietnam. There's debates about all of those things. But the big picture that Kennedy articulates in the summer of '63, we don't want a Pax Americana, he says. Imagine that. Imagine if there was a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate who said, we don't want a Pax Americana. We are in a Pax Americana era right now. We are establishing Pax Americana in Ukraine, Gaza. You know, we are trying to maintain that. There is another way, and the other way died with Kennedy.
Yeah, and whether the key thing to me is whether or not the CIA actually assassinated him. Every president since Kennedy, including LBJ, believed that they did.
Yeah, and operated accordingly.
Exactly.
And this is super important, where there's this discourse that tries to marginalize, conspiracy theorists. Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon had their foibles, had their problems. They were not conspiracy theorists. These were men of power who understood how American power worked. And none of them believed the CIA's story of a quote unquote.
Yeah, they were terrified of them. They were terrified of them in the FBI. That's right. And it governed a lot of their decision making. Highly recommend people subscribe to.
And that's why Trump did not release the documents.
Most likely, yeah, seriously. Yeah, there you go. Subscribe to the Substack, buy the books. Appreciate you joining us, sir. Thank you.
Thanks a million, guys.
Absolutely. We'll see you guys later.